Here we are again talking about stories. This video is for class on Thursday. What is that? April 2nd. Let me double check. Yes, Thursday, April 2nd. So today we're talking about horror. We're talking about spooky stories about Carmen Maria Machado's The Husband Stitch, which we've read something from Machado before, if you remember. It's The Resident. So I wonder if you saw any similarities between this story and her last. So we're talking about that. We're gonna compare it a little bit, or I might ask you to compare it a little bit with the techniques of fiction that we saw in Octavia Butler's story. So, as always, to get started, I'm just gonna kind of benchmark us in the syllabus, make sure that we know what's coming up, what we need to do. So let's just take a look at the syllabus real quick before we get started. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to make this, oh dear, I'm trying to make it smaller. Okay. I don't even know if I have my, oh, here it is. Okay, so this is where we are, today, Thursday, April 2nd. We're going to talk about this Machado story. You're going to email me your critiques for Shannon and for this, or you're going to email me your response for this video and this Machado story by 11:59 tonight, Thursday, April 2nd. Okay, so that's what's going on for this class. For this weekend, what I need you to do is read Nicole's story and write a critique, and you're going to email me a critique for that by 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, April 7, and then you're going to read these two stories, The School and The Girl in the Flammable Skirt. So next Tuesday, we're talking about magical realism and then fantasy. So that is what's going on this weekend. Next week, so next Tuesday, I'm going to be emailing you about your current grade. Okay, so I'll email you where you stand in the class, and yeah, all of your assignment grades, and then I'm gonna ask you. Excuse me. I'm going to ask you whether or not you'd like to do some extra credit. All right. So just my teaching philosophy, I'd rather you learn something in my class than stress about your grades. So I want everybody who wants to do well in my class to have the opportunity to do well. And so we'll talk more about what that extra credit opportunity will look like next week. Just know that that is coming up next week. Know that you're going to be able to know where you stand and have the opportunity to raise your grade if you choose, so that when those final grades come along, there are no surprises at all. Okay, so that's what's going on. This weekend, just focus on Nicole's story and these two magical realism stories. They're both pretty short. I think you should enjoy them. So let's get started with the Machado story. I will pull it up here, and if we were together, I would ask someone to summarize, which would be fun, but we're not together, which is terribly sad. Anyways, at least we are following the social distancing guidelines. I'm not even sure how I would summarize this story if I had to. There's a lot that's going on, which is the reason that I chose this story. There's a lot that's interesting to dig into and talk about. I know it's really raunchy, and I apologize. I forget how raunchy these stories are until I reread them, and I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe I assigned that. But I am glad that you read it because there's so much to talk about, and there's a lot that's going on, like genre and mode-wise, that I think is important that we look into. But I promise that our next couple stories will not be this explicit. I think I really put you guys through the ringer in terms of explicit stories this semester. I'm sorry. Hopefully it did something to hold your attention, maybe. Anyways, so getting into the meat of this story. So we've got a story with a woman who's got a ribbon around her neck. We learn throughout the course of the story that every woman has some sort of ribbon, whether it's around her ankle or her finger or whatever, and the ribbon is just sort of there. And then her husband, throughout the story, wants to know what this ribbon is about, and she's like, it's just my ribbon. And throughout the story, we have these two really interesting elements that we're going to talk about here in a second. The first is these read aloud, which I'm highlighting, these read aloud directions, right? Which are really strange and interrupt the story in a really interesting way. My favorite one is this pennies. Yeah, this direction to shake a can of pennies in front of the person closest to you. So we have these metafictional directions, which are directly given to the reader. And then the second element we have, which is metafictional in its own way, and really interesting, are these small vignettes, which we've talked about as like a small anecdote, a small story. And there are several of these kind of couched within the larger narrative, and they're all sort of urban legends or myths. You guys probably recognize some of them. The hook-handed man, right? So we've got retellings of these urban legends that she slips in throughout her narrative. And she sort of moralizes them for the reader, which is really interesting. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but first I want to kind of talk about the basics of the horror genre and kind of the tradition that Machado is working in here. So if we go back to our handy-dandy notebook, our chart here, I've expanded it by one. I'm still too big. I want to make myself smaller. Okay, I've expanded it by one column, okay? So we've got our science fiction here from Butler's story, and now we're looking at Machado. So if we start off with characterization, if we were together, we would talk about how these characters are characterized, but we're not together. So just from my perspective, I think what's going on with characterization here in this particular story is that we have round characters to some extent, but not quite as round as what's going on, not quite as realistic as what's going on in science fiction. And I would say that because of the characterization of the husband, who's never really fully portrayed to us. We have a narrator with complex desires and fears, and this isn't a critique of the story, it's just sort of what goes on. We never see the husband's sort of interiority. We just know that he wants to untie the ribbon. We know that the narrator thinks he's a good guy, but we don't really know anything else about him. So we have a round narrator, and this is important because we're supposed to sympathize with her fear. So the characterization is sort of teaching us about emotional investment in the story and who we're supposed to who we're supposed to sympathize with. So we have round-ish characters. And this is kind of true throughout the horror genre, and it's hard to sort of make broad statements about the horror genre from this one story. But if you think about other horror movies you know, or even just Scooby-Doo, right? Other scary stories, we have round portrayals of the people that we're supposed to sympathize with, the people we're supposed to feel fear with, and then the people that we're not feeling fear along with, we often have sort of more mysterious, not full characterizations. So we've got some roundish characters. And then let's think about what's going on with the plot in this story. And what I want to sort of focus on with these next three guys here is that horror depends for its life on the withholding of exposition. That's so important to horror. How do I get this guy to go away? Oh, there we go. So it depends on withholding exposition. What do I mean by that? Think of any horror movie. Let's go back to Scooby-Doo. Every episode ends when the monster is revealed or the cause of the disturbance is revealed. Yeah, okay, so I'm thinking of like the Babadook now, that movie. It's on Netflix. You should watch it if you want to pee your pants a little bit. But it ends when we know the nature of the monster, right? And I won't reveal the ending because it's a great movie. But horror sort of ends when the characters finally understand what's been going on. They get to the bottom of it. So we've got a plot here that follows the unveiling of invention. So in this story, the invention is the ribbon, right? The ribbon. And the unveiling in this story is really interesting because it serves a different purpose than a lot of other kind of unveilings of invention and other horror stories. And it has a lot to do, I think, if we were together, we would talk about this, has a lot to do, I think, with gender and with relationships between men and women. And it's interesting that the unveiling of the invention is horrifying the character that we're not close to. We could say a lot about that, but let's keep moving forward. So our plot sort of, we follow this woman through her marriage. We know that she's got this ribbon, and the story ends when finally the purpose of the ribbon is revealed. And so, okay, exposition. We've talked about exposition. What's important about the use of exposition in this story and within horror stories is that exposition is withheld. So if we knew the purpose of the ribbon from the beginning, there would hardly be a story, right? The husband wouldn't be curious anymore. If we knew the perpetrator in the episodes of Scooby-Doo, poor Shaggy and Scooby would not be so scared and would not have to run around being haunted by portraits. So what's important is that we don't know what's going on with the invention. And so finally down here, we've got the ribbon, and I don't want to generalize about inventions in horror, but I think to some extent, inventions in horror make intangible ideas tangible. And this is a concept that we'll come back to next Tuesday with magical realism. But I think a lot of what goes on in horror, and now I'm going back to the Babadook, is that we just have these physical manifestations of intangible or abstract terrors. Okay, so invention makes intangible tangible. And then so our plot is spurred by that invention. It's spurred by the ghost or the monster or whatever. But we don't understand the nature of that invention just because of how horror stories are written until the very end of the story. So that's what keeps, as Jerome Stern would say, the lid on the pot. That's what keeps the tension going, the conflict boiling, is the fact that we don't know what's going on. And it's up to the author to sort of artfully hide what's going on without us feeling like the author is too much of a presence here. So that's kind of what's going on with these basic elements of fiction in this story. And before we kind of wrap up here, I want to address those two things that I pointed out in the beginning of our little video here. And they are the directions directly pointed to the reader about how we should read this out loud. The can of shaking the pennies and what voices we should use for which characters, and also the small vignettes interspersed. So in your responses to this video, I'm going to ask you, well, one of my questions will ask you to kind of engage with these two metafictional elements, which are drawing attention to the nature of storytelling. And my little blurb here about these two things is that I think you went upstairs, Andy.
Oh, okay.
My thought here about these two elements are that this is a story that's very consciously following the tradition of horror. It's very consciously following these patterns of urban legends. So we have all these kind of legends, these scary stories woven throughout this scary story. And she even says at one point, all stories sort of blend into one another. And it's my thought that she's sort of looking to elevate her own story and weave her own story into this tradition of urban legends. And because of that, she's using the same techniques of characterization that all of these other stories use. She's using the same techniques of withholding exposition and characterization that these other stories are using. And to that end, I think that these read aloud instructions also, in a really ostentatious or very present manner, also draw attention to the idea of story. And I think that a lot of these legends, right, are oral and they're passed down orally. And I think that in including these read aloud directions, she's sort of looking to add that oral element to her horror story. So we've got these two really non-traditional elements going on in this story, and yet we have these two really traditional, or not two, I'm sorry, we have all these really traditional uses of exposition and characterization and plot and invention. So in your responses, I'm going to ask you to kind of engage with this, maybe ask you to engage with some of these newer elements and think about how they're working in this story. All right, so that is what's going on for this class and this story. And then for next weekend, you'll be reading those two short magical realism stories and Nicole's story. And I will have that video up by next Monday, at 8 p.m., but probably earlier. So just really quick before I hang up here on you, it looks like you only have, so you're only going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more videos of my face to watch, which is terribly sad for you, I'm sure. Okay, also, here's a final surprise. Oh, this is my coronavirus baby. This is Henry. Say hi, Henry. Hi, everyone. Okay, hope you guys are doing well. I will talk to you later. Bye.